Under the shifting mists of the Welsh mountains, ridges of gray stone stretched like ancient ramparts, their peaks lost in cloud, their valleys filled with the sound of shepherds' horns and the low songs of wandering bards. To the north, the wide rivers and dark glens of Scotland cut through a land equally wild and proud, its people bound together by a fierce desire to preserve their independence. At the close of the 13th century, these were the last frontiers of the British Isles that still stood apart from the dominion of the English crown. Wales and Scotland were lands steeped in old freedoms, guarded by their mountains, and defended by a stubborn sense of identity. It was into this contested world that Edward of England entered, a king who would forever alter the fate of those borderlands. Edward I, remembered by history as Longshanks for his remarkable height and bearing, embodied both the discipline of a soldier and the authority of a monarch. His tall frame and stern demeanor gave him an aura of inevitability, as though he were destined to command. Chroniclers wrote of his piercing gaze and his severe character, a man who held himself and others to strict account. Unlike his father, Henry III, whose long reign had been marked by hesitancy and the concessions of a weak king, Edward was determined to build a monarchy that no subject could resist. His rule would become a relentless campaign to expand the crown's reach and secure obedience from all who lived within his grasp. The foundation for this ambition had been laid in his youth. Born in 1239, Edward grew up during years of unrest, for his father's inability to command respect left England fractured. The barons, led by Simon de Montfort, rose in open defiance. Civil war tore the realm apart, and the young prince was thrust directly into its turmoil. Captured once by Montfort's forces and later released, Edward learned firsthand the peril of divided loyalty and the humiliation of royal weakness. He would not forget the lesson. In 1265, at the Battle of Evesham, he commanded the king's forces with decisive energy, crushing Montfort and ending the rebellion. That victory made clear that Edward was no ordinary heir, but a leader forged in fire, willing to use force without hesitation when the authority of the crown was at stake. Civil conflict had sharpened his conception of kingship. He would not bend before noble pressure as his father had done. He believed that rebellion must be met not with compromise, but with unflinching strength. These convictions would guide him throughout his reign, shaping every campaign, every statute, every decision of governance. Edward's horizons, however, were not limited to England. In 1270, he journeyed east to join the Ninth Crusade, setting sail for the Holy Land with a modest following. Though the expedition achieved little in terms of conquest, the experience broadened his vision. In Acre, he found himself among kings and warriors from across Christendom, confronting adversaries whose conviction matched his own. He saw that leadership required not only resolve, but the ability to inspire loyalty across great distances and through immense hardship. Even the attempt on his life, when he was stabbed by an assassin's blade, served to deepen the myth that destiny preserved him for greater things. When he returned to England in 1274, he did so not as a sheltered heir, but as a crusader who had tested himself in foreign lands. His coronation followed the death of Henry III, and the contrast between father and son was stark. Where Henry had been cautious, Edward was decisive. Where Henry had compromised, Edward imposed order. The crown under Edward's hand would no longer be a fragile prize contested by magnates, but an instrument of authority wielded with iron intent. The Plantagenet inheritance he carried demanded both ambition and endurance. His grandfather Henry II had built a vast realm stretching from the Pyrenees to the Scottish border, but time and rebellion had weakened the empire. Edward's task was to restore strength at home and extend power abroad. He did so not only through campaigns of war, but through a systematic reorganization of law and governance. Statutes issued during his reign clarified obligations, rights, and tenures, binding his subjects more closely to royal authority. The law became a tool of conquest as surely as the sword, for order allowed taxation, taxation built armies, and armies secured dominion. This blending of law and war defined Edward's kingship. He was as comfortable drafting statutes as he was leading armies into hostile terrain. He built castles as symbols of both military strength and administrative control. His vision was not of a crown content to reign, but of a crown compelled to dominate, to draw the disparate lands of the British Isles into one unified realm under his command. By the late 1270s, the stage was prepared for conquest. Wales, fractured among rival princes yet bound by culture and tradition, presented itself as Edward's first target. Its mountains offered natural fortresses, its people cherished independence, but its political divisions made it vulnerable to an organized assault. Edward saw in Wales an opportunity not merely for expansion but for demonstration that resistance to the crown would be futile. Scotland, proud of its history and wealth, stood as the next challenge. For the moment it was stable under King Alexander III, but Edward understood the fragility of dynasties and the advantage a determined neighbor might take. His eyes were fixed northward, anticipating the moment when Scotland too would falter. Edward's reign was thus never conceived as an age of quiet rule. It was the saga of a warrior king, determined to press outward, to crush disobedience, and to impose unity upon lands that had long resisted. The story of Edward I is the story of relentless ambition colliding with ancient freedoms, of castles rising on conquered ground, and of peoples who refused to forget their independence, even under foreign rule. This is the tale of Longshanks, conqueror of Wales and hammer of the Scots. To follow his life is to walk through the echo of battlefields, to stand in the shadow of fortresses he built, and to witness the turning points that shaped Britain's destiny. His reign reminds us that history is not only written in treaties and statutes, but in the clash between power and resistance, in the choices of rulers who sought to bind together a kingdom that had never been fully tamed. And so, the journey begins with the image of a king whose iron will change the map of the British Isles forever. If you wish to see how ambition forged conflict and how freedom endured in defiance, continue with this story, for the tale of Edward I is only the beginning. Thus, as Edward returned from crusade and took the English crown with firm resolve, his gaze soon settled upon the lands that had long eluded his father's grasp. If England was to be secure, the borders could not remain restless. Wales, fractured in politics yet bound by ancient pride, stood as both the nearest opportunity and the first test of his will. To understand the struggle that followed, one must first look closely at the country itself, its princes, its rivalries, and the spirit of a people who believed their mountains could shield their freedom. Before Edward ever set his gaze on Wales, the land itself was already a kingdom of contrasts, fractured politically, yet united by spirit and song. Rugged mountains divided valleys from valleys, and across those valleys rose the banners of small principalities. Gwynedd, in the north, stood proud and powerful, its princes claiming ancient rights as leaders of the Welsh people. Powys stretched across the borderlands, torn between alliances with the English crown and loyalty to its own traditions. To the south lay Deheubarth, a land of shifting fortunes where dynasties rose and fell with the rhythm of internal rivalries. For centuries, these principalities had contended with one another as much as they resisted their larger neighbor to the east. No single ruler had ever fully united them for long. Geography itself conspired against central rule. Mountain chains cut through the land, rivers served as barriers, and local loyalties often ran deeper than national ones. Yet despite division, there was one house that carried a stronger claim to preeminence: the rulers of Gwynedd. By the mid-13th century, that claim belonged to Llywelyn ap Gruffudd, known later as Llywelyn the Last. He was the grandson of Llywelyn the Great, who had once forced English kings to recognize his authority. Building upon that legacy, Llywelyn ap Gruffudd sought to extend his dominion over the other Welsh princes, pressing them to acknowledge him as overlord. His vision was bold: to forge a Wales strong enough to resist outside conquest, to transform fragile alliances into something resembling a nation. For a time it seemed possible. Through war and diplomacy, Llywelyn expanded his power, and in 1267 the Treaty of Montgomery saw even the English crown, then still under Henry III, formally acknowledge him as Prince of Wales. It was a remarkable achievement, a rare moment when Wales appeared united under one banner. But the unity was fragile. resting less on permanent allegiance than on Llywelyn's personal strength. Rival Welsh lords resented his dominance, and some sought advantage by aligning themselves with England. Even within his own family, dissent simmered. His brother Gruffudd would one day betray him, shifting loyalties in pursuit of his own claim. Such divisions would prove decisive when Edward ascended the English throne, determined to impose his will. Yet to understand why the struggle mattered so deeply, one must look beyond politics to the culture of Wales itself. The land was not merely a map of borders and castles, but a living tapestry of traditions stretching back to Celtic antiquity. In the courts of Welsh princes, bards sang of heroes and ancient battles, their verses carrying the memory of a people whose identity was forged in resistance. Harps and poetry were not ornaments of leisure, but instruments of history, ensuring that the deeds of rulers, both noble and flawed, would be remembered. In every song lay the echo of freedom. The landscape itself reinforced that spirit. Wales was a land of steep hills, deep forests, and swift rivers, territory difficult for any invader to master. Castles might be planted in its valleys, but armies struggled to control the mountains. Villages clung to the land with a tenacity that mirrored the people's sense of belonging. Their culture was interwoven with the environment. The mountains were not barriers to them, but guardians, shaping a worldview that valued endurance, kinship, and loyalty to ancestral soil. This was the Wales Edward confronted, a country fractured yet proud, led by a prince who aspired to unity, but hemmed in by rivals and by the realities of geography. Llywelyn ap Gruffudd carried the hope of a nation within him, yet he ruled in an age when the balance of power was shifting. England under Edward was stronger, more centralized, and guided by a king whose resolve was far harder than that of Henry III. Wales, despite its spirit, would soon face the greatest challenge of its history. Still, before the clash began, there was a moment suspended in possibility. In Llywelyn's Wales, one can glimpse a nation that might have endured. Bards singing in the great halls of Gwynedd, chieftains debating alliances, and common folk clinging to the dream that their land could remain their own. It was a fragile dream, one that rested on the shoulders of a single man. The shadow of Edward was lengthening, and soon the valleys would echo not only with songs but with the tramp of foreign soldiers. Yet in that twilight before conquest, Wales stood defiant, defined not by what it lacked, but by the fierce resilience of its people and the unbroken thread of its cultural memory. Yet shadows were lengthening across the valleys. Llywelyn's fragile unity, so carefully built on legacy and ambition, stood against a new king unlike any before. Edward I had returned from crusade, hardened, decisive, and unwilling to brook defiance. Where his father had once tolerated Welsh assertion, Edward saw only rebellion. The mountains still guarded their people. The bards still sang of freedom. But a different kind of power was gathering beyond the eastern border, a power organized, disciplined, and relentless. Soon, the fragile dream of independence would be tested by the iron will of a monarch determined to prove that no prince could stand apart from his crown. By the mid-12th century, the fragile balance that Llywelyn ap Gruffudd had struggled to build was already beginning to fracture. His recognition as Prince of Wales under the Treaty of Montgomery a decade earlier had seemed like the dawn of a new age, but the rise of Edward I transformed the situation overnight. Edward was not his father Henry III. He was sharper, harder, and far less tolerant of challenges to the crown. To a king like Edward, Llywelyn's assertion of authority over other Welsh princes was not the mark of a respected ally, but a direct challenge to his supremacy. The conflict did not begin with swords, but with words and refusals. Llywelyn was summoned repeatedly to Edward's court to render homage, the feudal duty owed by a prince to his overlord. To appear and kneel would have been a visible acknowledgement of Edward's supremacy, but Llywelyn, proud and wary of losing face before his own people, declined the summons again and again. He claimed his safety was uncertain, that he could not trust Edward's intentions. To Edward, excuses were nothing more than defiance. A vassal who refused to perform homage was a vassal who invited war. The tensions deepened further when Llywelyn sought to marry Eleanor de Montfort, the daughter of Simon de Montfort, once Edward's bitter enemy in the Barons' War. For Edward, this alliance was intolerable, a reminder of rebellion at home and a dangerous symbol of defiance abroad. Eleanor was captured at sea by English forces before she could ever reach Wales, and Edward held her in custody, a calculated insult to Llywelyn's pride. By now, reconciliation was impossible. The stage was set for the first great clash between Edward's England and a united Welsh leadership. In 1276, Edward moved with deliberate resolve. He summoned a great council, declared Llywelyn a rebel, and began preparations for war on a scale Wales had never before witnessed. England's resources dwarfed those of its smaller neighbor. From every shire came summonses for knights, archers, and foot soldiers. From the marches came the lords, who had long sought opportunities to expand their influence into Welsh lands. The campaign, though, was not merely a royal expedition, but a national mobilization, a demonstration of what a centralized monarchy could now achieve. As the English host advanced into the borderlands in 1277, the difference in strength was stark. Chroniclers speak of tens of thousands called to arms under Edward's banners, an overwhelming show of force. The English armies pressed into Wales from multiple directions, coordinated and supplied with a discipline that reflected Edward's strategic mind. For the Welsh, who had often relied on swift raids and the shelter of mountains, the sheer scale of Edward's advance left little room for maneuver. Llywelyn attempted to rally resistance, but many of his supposed allies within Wales saw the tide turning and began to desert him. Old rivalries resurfaced, and local leaders judged that their survival depended on bending the knee to Edward. The campaign was as much psychological as military. Edward built roads and supply lines, constructed temporary fortifications, and made it clear that the crown could sustain its power even in the harsh terrain of Wales. Where once English expeditions had been short and sporadic, Edward demonstrated permanence. This was not a raid, but an occupation in the making. By the summer of 1277, Llywelyn's position was untenable. His armies were dwindling, his allies unreliable, and his lands increasingly hemmed in by English advances. With no hope of victory, he was forced to sue for peace. The terms that followed were harsh, stripping away much of what Llywelyn had achieved over the past decade. The Treaty of Aberconwy, signed in November 1277, reduced Llywelyn's power to a shadow of its former breadth. While he retained the title of Prince of Wales, his authority was confined largely to his heartland in Gwynedd. Vast territories he had claimed across central and southern Wales were taken away and redistributed to Edward's allies among the Marcher lords. His rivals within Wales were elevated, fragmenting the unity he had once imposed. To make the humiliation complete, Llywelyn was at last compelled to perform homage to Edward, acknowledging him as his overlord. What had once been recognition on near equal terms became submission. The treaty marked a turning point. Though Wales remained unconquered in name, its independence was gravely weakened. Edward had shown that he could summon overwhelming strength and that the crown would not hesitate to impose its will. Llywelyn had been humbled, but not destroyed. He still ruled Gwynedd, and his people still looked to him as their leader. Yet the dream of a fully united, independent Wales had been broken, reduced now to a fragile remnant. For Edward, the campaign of 1276 to 1277 was a calculated victory. He had tested his military machine and proven its effectiveness. He had curtailed the power of a defiant prince and secured the loyalty of Welsh rivals. But Edward was not content to stop there. The conquest of Wales was not complete, only begun. The castles he would soon build and the wars yet to come would carry the struggle to new heights. Still, in the aftermath of the first campaign, the valleys of Wales lay quiet under uneasy peace. Bards mourned the loss of lands and the humbling of their prince, yet they kept alive the memory of independence. Llywelyn himself retreated to the fastness of Gwynedd, his pride wounded, but his spirit not yet broken. For the Welsh people, the story was far from over. For Edward, the road ahead was clear. The hammer had struck once, but it would strike again, harder and more final than before. The silence that followed the Treaty of Aberconwy was never more than fragile. In the valleys of Gwynedd, Llywelyn nursed his wounded pride, while across Wales the people endured the growing presence of English officials and the encroachment of Marcher lords. To Edward, the matter seemed settled, a prince humbled and a land subdued. But beneath the outward calm, old rivalries and festering grievances remained unresolved. The Peace of 1277 was not a conclusion, it was only an interlude. Within a few years, the embers of resentment would flare once more, ignited from within Llywelyn's own family, and Wales would rise again against the crown. The uneasy peace imposed by the Treaty of Aberconwy could not last. Though Edward I had humbled Llywelyn ap Gruffudd, he had not extinguished the spirit of resistance that ran through the hills and valleys of Wales. For a time, Llywelyn remained confined to Gwynedd, his power reduced, his pride wounded. Yet beneath the surface, discontent simmered. Edward's heavy hand, the growing presence of English officials, and the steady encroachment of marcher lords all served to deepen resentment. The Peace of 1277 was less a resolution than a pause before the storm. The spark came from within Llywelyn's own family. In 1282, his brother Gruffudd ap Gruffudd, once an ally of Edward, turned suddenly against the English crown. Whether driven by ambition, frustration, or the desire to reclaim what had been lost, Gruffudd launched a bold strike against the English garrisons. His attack was not merely an act of defiance, it was the opening signal for a national rising. Across Wales, old loyalties rekindled. Chieftains and common folk alike rose once more, rallying to the cause of independence. For Edward, the rebellion was both unexpected and infuriating. He had considered Gruffudd a beneficiary of his policy, rewarded with lands for his loyalty. Now this very man had betrayed him. To Edward, it was proof of Welsh unreliability, a justification for total conquest. Where once he had sought to weaken and contain Llywelyn, he now resolved to bring all of Wales under English dominion permanently and without compromise. The campaign that followed dwarfed even that of 1277. Edward gathered a vast host, drawing forces from across England and beyond. Engineers and builders accompanied the soldiers, tasked with constructing the castles and roads that would make conquest lasting. The English advance pressed deep into the heart of Wales from multiple directions, overwhelming the smaller Welsh forces that sought to resist. The rebellion, though spirited, could not match the scale of Edward's machine. Llywelyn, though initially hesitant, was drawn into the rising. The prince who had been humbled now stood again as the figurehead of resistance. He sought to rally his people, to give them hope that independence could still be won. Yet the odds were heavily against him. Even so, the struggle reached a dramatic climax in December 1282 at the banks of the River Irfan, near Builth, at a place called Orwyn Bridge. The battle was swift but decisive. Llywelyn, separated from his main force, was caught in a skirmish that ended his life. The manner of his death remained shrouded in the uncertainties of chronicle and legend, but its impact was clear. With the fall of Llywelyn, the last great prince of an independent Wales was gone. The bards who had once sung of victories now turned to laments, declaring him the last, in recognition that no leader after him would ever truly unite the nation. Yet the war did not end immediately. Gruffudd assumed leadership, carrying on the struggle with desperate resolve. But without his brother's stature and with the English tightening their grip, his cause was doomed. Edward's armies pursued him relentlessly, dismantling the remnants of Welsh resistance piece by piece. By the spring of 1283, Gruffudd had been captured. His death brought final closure to the rising, and with it, the dream of an independent Wales faded into memory. Edward's triumph was complete. No longer content with treaties or partial submission, he imposed direct rule. To secure his conquest, he embarked on a monumental program of castle building, unparalleled in Europe at the time. At Caernarfon, Conwy, Harlech, and later Beaumaris, massive fortresses rose, symbols of English power carved into the Welsh landscape. These were not just military strongholds, but statements of dominion intended to awe the local population and remind them daily of the authority of their new ruler. The conquest also brought administrative change. English sheriffs and justiciars replaced native governance, law was restructured, and the nobility of Wales was pushed aside or reduced to subservience. Edward ensured that his victory was not merely a passing event, but a transformation of the political order. His heir, the future Edward II, was given the title Prince of Wales, a calculated gesture that made permanent the subordination of the land and his people. Yet despite conquest, Wales did not lose its soul. The songs of the bards endured, preserving the memory of Llywelyn and the struggle for freedom. In cottages and villages, the people carried forward their traditions, their language, and their pride. The mountains still stood, silent witnesses to both defeat and endurance. Edward had won militarily, but in doing so, he had created a legacy of resistance that would never entirely disappear. For Edward himself, the campaign of 1282 to 1283 was a defining triumph. He had shown that no prince, however proud, could defy the crown. The conquest of Wales became a cornerstone of his reign, a demonstration of the iron will that earned him the title Longshanks. Yet in the echoes of Orowin Bridge and in the lamentations that followed Llywelyn's death, the story of Wales became more than one of defeat. It became a legend, a tale of a people whose freedom was taken, but whose identity endured. And so, by the close of 1283, Edward stood victorious, his authority imposed upon the rugged lands of Wales. The castles rose as monuments to conquest, and the valleys lay under English law. But the songs of resistance whispered still in the shadows, promising that though the prince was gone, the memory of Wales remained eternal. With Llywelyn fallen and Gruffudd dragged to his end, the last flicker of princely resistance was snuffed out. The banners of revolt no longer flew, and the valleys lay silent under English watch. Yet Edward's purpose did not rest with victory on the battlefield. He knew that swords alone could not hold a restless land. To make Wales his in truth, he would need to carve his power into its very stones and weave his authority into the fabric of its laws. What followed was not the thunder of war, but the measured work of conquest made permanent. The conquest of 1282 to 1283 did more than break the power of Llywelyn and silence the last great rising of the Welsh princes. It reshaped the very landscape of Wales, both physically and politically, leaving behind a network of stone and authority that proclaimed Edward's dominion with unshakable clarity. From the ashes of resistance, Edward I set about remaking the country in his image. The most visible and enduring symbols of his conquest were the castles. Edward understood that military victory alone could not secure control of a land so mountainous and defiant. To dominate Wales, he would need fortresses, strongholds that would both guard and intimidate, serving as garrisons for his troops and as monuments to his power. Thus began one of the most ambitious programs of castle building in medieval Europe. At Caernarfon, he raised a fortress unlike any seen before on Welsh soil. Its polygonal towers and massive curtain walls, inspired in part by the architecture of Constantinople, spoke of imperial grandeur. Caernarfon was not just a military base, but a statement. This was to be the capital of a new order. Within its walls, Edward planted an English borough, settling colonists who would live under the king's protection, their presence intended to anchor English authority amid a Welsh countryside. To the east, Conwy Castle rose on a rocky outcrop beside the sea. With its 8 great towers and formidable walls, it controlled access to the coast and stood as a sentinel against rebellion. Across the mountains, Harlech Castle perched high above the Irish Sea, a near impregnable fortress that commanded awe simply by its position. Later, at Beaumaris, Edward's builders completed the vision, constructing a castle regarded as the pinnacle of medieval military architecture, a concentric masterpiece of stone designed for both strength and intimidation. Together, these castles formed a chain of dominance, linked by new roads and garrisons. They were fortresses, towns, and symbols all at once, part of a deliberate strategy to encircle Gwynedd and lock Wales within a lattice of stone. To live beneath their shadows was to be reminded daily of Edward's presence, even if the king himself resided far away in England. Alongside these physical structures came a transformation in governance. Edward did not trust the old Welsh aristocracy to manage their lands, nor did he permit them to retain their former independence. Instead, he installed English officials, sheriffs, justiciars, and administrators who enforced the laws of the crown. The Statute of Rhuddlan, issued in 1284, laid out the framework for English rule in Wales. It reorganized the land into counties, imposed English law in civil matters, and established royal courts to settle disputes. The Welsh, once subjects of their own princes, became now the king's subjects directly, their traditions subordinated to foreign authority. To Edward, this was not conquest alone but assimilation, a deliberate effort to fold Wales into the fabric of his kingdom. Where once the Welsh had sung of their princes and their laws, they now found themselves judged in English courts, their voices subdued under statutes written in a language not their own. Yet Edward was also a master of symbolism, and his conquest was sealed not only by law and stone, but by ceremony. In 1301, he granted his heir, the future Edward II, the title Prince of Wales. The gesture was calculated, even theatrical. By bestowing upon his son the very title once carried by Llywelyn ap Gruffudd, Edward declared that the legacy of the Welsh princes had been absorbed into his own dynasty. From that moment onward, the heir to the English throne would bear the title, transforming what had been a symbol of Welsh independence into a badge of English overlordship. Legend has it that Edward presented his infant son to the Welsh people at Caernarfon, proclaiming that he had given them a prince born in Wales who spoke no word of English. Whether the story is true or not, its persistence reflects the enduring bitterness of conquest and the cunning of Edward's statecraft. The title was meant to pacify and to dominate at once, a political sleight of hand that bound future kings of England to the memory of a subdued land. For the Welsh people, the consequences were profound. Their princes were gone, their autonomy dismantled, their lands threaded with castles garrisoned by foreign soldiers. They had become subjects of a distant monarch whose will was carried out by strangers. Yet even in subjugation, their culture endured. The bards continued to sing, though now their songs were laments rather than celebrations. Their language survived in hearth and marketplace, their identity preserved in stories whispered beneath the shadow of Edward's fortresses. For Edward, however, the conquest of Wales was a triumph without equal. He had not only defeated his enemies, but remade their land in a way that could not easily be undone. The castles stood as his monuments, the statutes as his legacy, and the title of Prince of Wales as his final word on the matter. He was, in truth and in symbol, Edward, Lord of Wales. And yet, as complete as his victory seemed, the story of Edward's reign did not end in the mountains of Snowdonia or the halls of Caernarfon. Beyond the northern border lay another land, older and prouder still, where independence burned no less fiercely. Scotland awaited him, and in the years to come, Edward would turn his relentless gaze there, seeking to hammer yet another nation into submission. Wales had fallen, but the greater struggle was only beginning. Edward's triumph in Wales seemed absolute. Castles crowned the mountains, English law spread through the valleys, and even the title of Prince of Wales had been bound to his dynasty. Yet conquest breeds new horizons. As Wales was chained into the fabric of his realm, Edward's gaze lifted northward. Beyond the rugged border lay Scotland, older in its monarchy and prouder in its independence. For the moment, it stood steady under King Alexander III, but Edward knew that even the strongest dynasties could falter, and when they did, he would be ready. In the years when Edward I cemented his mastery over Wales, Scotland to the north stood apart, an independent kingdom, proud of its traditions and anchored in a monarchy that had endured through storms of its own. The 13th century had seen Scotland flourish under the rule of King Alexander III, a monarch whose reign brought relative stability to a land often caught between ambition from England and the rugged independence of its own nobility. Under Alexander, Scotland experienced something rare: peace, prosperity, and a sense of unity that allowed its people to look with confidence toward the future. Alexander III's rule was marked by prudence and strength. He secured Scotland's borders not only by force of arms, but by careful diplomacy. His marriage to Margaret of England, daughter of Henry III, had for a time softened the tensions between the two kingdoms. When that union produced heirs, it seemed as though the line of succession was secure and that Scotland could maintain its independence without constant threat. Alexander extended his authority to the Western Isles, consolidating Scotland's reach, while the nobility, though fractious by nature, respected his leadership. For a generation, the kingdom stood firm, its independence not in doubt. But the stability of monarchies in the medieval world was always fragile, bound to the fortunes of a single life. In March 1286, fate struck with sudden force. Alexander, riding at night along the coast, was thrown from his horse and killed. His death ended not only a long reign, but the balance that had kept Scotland steady. With him vanished the sense of certainty that had underpinned the kingdom. The crown passed, in theory, to his granddaughter Margaret, a child known to history as the Maid of Norway. Margaret was the daughter of Alexander's daughter, married into the royal house of Norway. At the time of Alexander's death, she was scarcely 3 years old, living far from the land she was meant to inherit. Her claim was legitimate, but her presence in a distant court created a void in Scotland itself. The nobles who had long rallied behind Alexander now found themselves without a leader on Scottish soil, and the old rivalries that had been held in check began to stir. The kingdom entered a period of uncertainty, suspended between loyalty to a child queen across the sea and the ambitions of powerful magnates at home. A group of guardians was appointed to govern in her name, but their authority was precarious, reliant on fragile cooperation. The vacuum at the heart of the monarchy created opportunity and danger alike. Every noble family with royal blood began to calculate its chances, and whispers of competing claims spread through the land. The situation grew still more complicated because of Scotland's proximity to England. Edward I, fresh from his triumph in Wales, looked northward and saw both weakness and opportunity. He had long considered himself not just King of England, but overlord of the whole island. The uncertainty in Scotland offered him a chance to make that vision real. The very fact that the Scottish crown now rested in the hands of a child raised abroad made the kingdom vulnerable to outside interference. The Maid of Norway became less a child than a symbol, a fragile thread connecting the kingdom's past to an uncertain future. Plans were even discussed for her to marry Edward's son, the young Prince of Wales, which would have bound the two crowns together. For a moment, the possibility of a union between England and Scotland seemed real. Yet fate, once again, had other designs. In 1290, as Margaret set sail to claim her inheritance, she fell ill and died before ever setting foot on Scottish soil. With her death, the line of Alexander III was extinguished. Scotland, for all its proud independence, was left without a clear heir. The throne stood vacant, and into that vacancy rushed a storm of rivalries. The kingdom that had known stability under Alexander was now plunged into crisis. Over a dozen claimants came forward, each asserting some right to the crown through tangled lines of descent. The guardians who had governed in Margaret's name could not resolve the dispute alone. It was in this moment of uncertainty, with Scotland's throne empty and its nobles divided, that Edward I moved to assert his authority. What had been a stable, independent realm only a few years earlier had become a land at the mercy of events. The death of a king, the youth of an heir abroad, and the sudden extinction of the line left Scotland vulnerable, and Edward, ever watchful, was ready to step into the breach. The story of Wales had been one of conquest by arms. The story of Scotland would begin with a crown left vacant, a people uncertain, and a foreign king eager to claim the role of arbiter. What followed would plunge the two kingdoms into decades of war, rebellion, and legend. But it began here, in the twilight of Alexander III's reign, with a fall from a horse that reshaped the fate of a nation. Thus, with the death of the Maid of Norway, Scotland's throne stood empty, its nobles divided, and its future uncertain. The unity that Alexander III had built was gone, replaced by rivalries and whispered claims. It was a kingdom adrift without a monarch to steady its course, and into that vacuum stepped Edward of England. Fresh from his conquest of Wales, he saw not tragedy, but opportunity, a chance to extend his authority beyond the border. To the Scots he offered judgment. To himself he claimed supremacy. What began as a plea for arbitration would soon bind Scotland in chains of homage and law. When the young Maid of Norway died in 1290, Scotland was plunged into a void deeper than the loss of a monarch. It was not merely a dynastic crisis, but an existential one, for the kingdom suddenly found itself without a clear heir to the throne, without unity, and without the strong hand that had kept the magnates in check. The guardians who had been entrusted to govern on Margaret's behalf struggled to contain the rivalries that now threatened to tear the land apart. Each great family with royal blood pressed its claim, and whispers of civil war spread like mist over the glens. In this uncertainty, all eyes turned south. Edward I of England, fresh from his triumph in Wales, offered himself as arbiter. To the Scottish lords, the idea had an appeal, an impartial authority to settle the dispute, a chance to avoid bloodshed. Yet Edward was no impartial judge. Behind the mask of mediator lay the steel of a conqueror. For Edward, the death of Margaret was not a tragedy to mourn, but an opportunity to seize. He would enter the Scottish succession crisis not as a guest, but as master. The episode that followed became known to history as the Great Cause. Between 1291 and 1292, Edward summoned the claimants to present their cases before him. There were many, but two emerged as principal contenders: John Balliol, with a direct but somewhat weaker genealogical claim, and Robert Bruce, grandfather of the future king, whose line also traced back to the royal house. Both sides marshaled their lawyers and chroniclers, producing rolls of genealogy and arguments steeped in the language of feudalist right. It was a courtroom staged across a kingdom, a spectacle of parchment and precedent. But Edward framed the proceedings on his own terms. Before he would hear a single claim, he demanded that the Scottish magnates acknowledge him as Lord Paramount, Overlord of Scotland. It was a masterstroke. By seeking arbitration, the nobles had already admitted his authority as mediator. By exacting homage first, Edward turned mediation into submission. One by one, the Scottish lords bent the knee, swearing loyalty not just as petitioners but as vassals. In that moment, Edward transformed the balance of power. The Great Cause was no longer a contest between Scots alone. It was a contest managed, directed, and ultimately owned by the King of England. The process dragged on for months, meticulously staged. Edward listened, questioned, and weighed the claims, all while reinforcing his dominance. To the Scots, his presence was suffocating but inescapable. To Edward, it was confirmation that his vision of lordship over the entire island was becoming reality. He was not simply a king presiding over his neighbors' affairs. He was reshaping the very fabric of sovereignty in Britain. In November 1292, Edward delivered his judgment. The crown, he declared, belonged to John Balliol. Balliol's claim through the senior line of descent was sound in law, and Edward cloaked his choice in the language of fairness and legitimacy. But in truth, John was chosen because he was the weaker of the candidates, a man whom Edward believed he could control. Robert Bruce, older and more formidable, might have resisted. Balliol, by contrast, seemed pliable. The new King of Scotland was crowned at Scone with the traditional ceremonies, but the celebration carried an uneasy undertone. To the Scots, Balliol was their king, anointed in the ancient manner. To Edward, he was no more than a vassal, raised up by English authority and bound to English will. The throne of Scotland remained in Edinburgh, but its strings were pulled from Westminster. Almost immediately, Edward set about reminding Balliol of his place. He demanded that disputes among Scottish nobles be appealed to his court in England, effectively stripping the Scottish crown of its sovereignty. He summoned Balliol to pay homage repeatedly, treating him less as a monarch than as a tenant in a feudal hierarchy. English officials pressed into Scottish affairs, their authority overshadowing that of Balliol's own ministers. It was a humiliation both subtle and relentless. Each demand, each reminder eroded the dignity of the Scottish throne. Balliol's authority shrank before the eyes of his subjects until he was seen not as a king, but as a puppet, dancing to the strings of Edward Longshanks. The resentment was swift and sharp. The Scottish nobility, once resigned to compromise, grew restive as they saw their independence evaporating. The guardians who had sought arbitration realized too late that they had delivered their kingdom into Edward's grasp. Among the people, the murmurs of discontent began to grow louder. The crown had not been lost in battle, but it was being hollowed from within, its substance drained by the steady hand of an English king who claimed to be only a judge. Edward, however, was satisfied. To him, the Great Cause had been a triumph of calculation. Without raising a sword, he had bent Scotland to his will. He had secured homage, imposed his authority, and placed a compliant ruler on the throne. The hammer that had struck Wales with force now struck Scotland with law. For Edward, it seemed a masterwork of kingship. For the Scots, it was a slow suffocation. The stage was set for deeper conflict. For a time, Balliol endured, torn between loyalty to Edward and duty to his people. But kings who wear crowns on another man's terms cannot endure for long. Scotland's patience would falter, its nobles would rebel, and its common folk would find champions who refused to bow. Out of the hollow reign of John Balliol, a fire was kindled that would burn far brighter. For now, though, the year was 1292. Edward I had placed his mark on the Scottish crown. A king sat at Scone, but the true master of Scotland resided in England. The great cause had ended, but the greater conflict was only beginning. At first, Edward seemed triumphant. Without raising an army, he had bent Scotland to his will, placed John Balliol on the throne, and secured homage from a kingdom once proud of its independence. Yet beneath the ceremonies and legal judgments, discontent smoldered. Each summons to Edward's court, each intrusion into Scottish affairs, eroded not only Balliol's authority, but the patience of his nobles. What Edward saw as mastery, the Scots felt as humiliation. And in that widening gulf, resentment began to harden into resistance. By the early 1290s, it was clear to all in Scotland that the crown worn by John Balliol was no crown of sovereignty. From the moment Edward I declared him king in 1292, Balliol had been treated less as a monarch than as a tenant of the English crown. Again and again, Edward summoned him to England to perform homage. Again and again, he undermined the dignity of the Scottish throne, overturning the decisions of Scottish courts, demanding appeals to his own, and treating the kingdom not as a partner, but as a possession. What stung most was Edward's intrusion into the very heart of governance. Scotland's nobles, proud of their traditions and jealous of their rights, found themselves subjected to the will of a distant king who showed no regard for their independence. Edward levied demands for service, imposed fines, and pressed financial burdens upon the realm. To a people already wary of outside control, the taxes and interference were intolerable. Balliol, caught between the English crown and his own subjects, seemed powerless to resist. He was mocked as Tum Tabard, the empty coat, his authority a hollow shell. The humiliation festered. In Edinburgh, in Stirling, in the halls of the great families, resentment deepened into anger. The magnates who had once thought arbitration would save them from bloodshed now realized they had been deceived. The independence of their kingdom had not been preserved. It had been bartered away under the guise of law. Edward's arrogance in treating Scotland as a vassal state created a unity of purpose that no single noble could have achieved alone. The determination to resist. By 1295, the mood had shifted from quiet grievance to open defiance. The Scottish Council, long disillusioned with Balliol's weakness, pressed him to act. He was still king, and though diminished, his crown still carried the weight of legitimacy. Under pressure from his nobles, Balliol agreed to throw off Edward's yoke. That year, the Scots took a fateful step. They sought alliance abroad. Their eyes turned to France, the old rival of England across the Channel. The French crown, itself eager to contain Edward's growing power, found in Scotland a natural ally. Negotiations were swift, for both nations shared a common enemy. By late 1295, a treaty was concluded, the Auld Alliance. It was an agreement of mutual support. If England attacked one, the other would respond. For the first time, Scotland bound its fate not only to its own borders, but to the larger struggle of Europe. The alliance was more than a treaty of convenience. It was a declaration that Scotland would not stand alone. With France at its back, the kingdom dared to imagine resisting Edward's might. For Edward, this was an unforgivable provocation. To him, Balliol's appeal to France was treason of the highest order, a rebellion against his rightful authority. For the Scots, it was the only path left, a desperate gamble to reclaim sovereignty before it was extinguished forever. Thus, on the eve of war, the lines were drawn. Edward, the conqueror of Wales, now saw Scotland not merely as a restless neighbor, but as a rebellious vassal in league with his continental foe. Balliol, long derided as a puppet, at last took a stand, though it was one forced upon him by the will of his nobles and the weight of his people's anger. The Auld Alliance would shape the destiny of Scotland for centuries, weaving its history into that of France, and ensuring that every English king henceforth would have to fight on two fronts. What began as a cry of frustration against taxes and interference had become a struggle not only for independence, but for survival against an empire that sought to encompass the whole of Britain. For now, Scotland stood defiant. The banners of resistance were being unfurled, and Edward, in his halls to the south, prepared his armies. The clash was inevitable. Balliol's crown, mocked as empty, was suddenly filled with peril and purpose, and Edward, who believed he had bent Scotland to his will without bloodshed, would soon learn that a kingdom may bend for a time, but it will not break quietly. The die was cast. With the Auld Alliance sealed and Edward preparing for war, Scotland stood at the brink. Its nobles had chosen defiance, but crowns and treaties alone could not carry the weight of resistance. What mattered now was the spirit of a people pushed beyond endurance. From the burden of taxes, from the scorn of foreign officials, from the daily humiliations that touched castle and cottage alike, anger smoldered, and out of that anger a new kind of leader would rise, not from the great dynasties, but from the shadows of obscurity. His name was William Wallace. By the mid-12th century, Scotland was a kingdom smoldering beneath the weight of humiliation. John Balliol, crowned with ceremony at Scone, had been reduced to little more than a puppet. His nobles whispered against him, his subjects mocked him, and his authority was daily eroded by the demands of Edward I. The verdicts of Scottish courts could be overturned in Westminster. Taxes were levied not for Scotland's benefit, but to fund England's wars abroad. The very symbols of sovereignty had been hollowed out. What had once been a proud and independent realm was now treated as a province of a foreign king. Among the magnates, frustration grew sharp. They had tolerated Balliol because he represented order, but what order remained when their rights were dismissed, their traditions disregarded? Edward's arrogance had united them in a way nothing else could. The nobility, long divided by rivalry, began to find common cause in resentment. And below them, among the farmers and townsfolk, the weight of foreign rule was felt no less keenly. Taxes pressed heavily, English officials interfered in local disputes, and soldiers imposed themselves on villages with little regard for custom. The sense of injustice was not confined to castles and courts. It seeped into the lives of ordinary men and women. From this soil of grievance sprang rebellion, and into this rebellion stepped a figure who, in the chronicles of the time, appears almost from the shadows: William Wallace. Unlike the noble families whose names carried centuries of lineage, Wallace was a knight of modest standing, known little beyond his own region. Yet in a moment, when Scotland longed for a champion, his name would rise like a banner. Wallace's origins remain partly veiled in uncertainty. Born likely in Elderslie near Paisley, he was not groomed for greatness in the halls of the aristocracy. His path was that of a man outside the great families, shaped not by inheritance but by circumstance. Some chronicles suggest that personal conflict with English officials, an insult, a quarrel, perhaps even the killing of an English sheriff, thrust him into open defiance. Whatever the spark, Wallace's resistance soon became more than a personal feud. It grew into a movement, carried by the tide of a people weary of submission. What set Wallace apart was not his birth, but his resolve. In a time when many nobles hesitated, calculating their advantage and fearing Edward's power, Wallace acted. He struck at English garrisons, attacked their officials, and inspired others to take up arms. His defiance, born in local skirmishes, resonated far beyond the borders of his own lands. To common folk, he became a symbol, proof that the English could be resisted, that Scotland need not bow forever. The nobility might have doubted him, but the people did not. Farmers, townsmen, and minor knights rallied to his side, drawn not by promises of wealth or power, but by the chance to fight for their country's honor. Wallace embodied the anger of a nation that had grown tired of humiliation. In his defiance, they saw their own. Thus, in the late 1290s, as Edward prepared to press his control ever deeper, Scotland began to stir in earnest. Balliol had fallen, the nobles grumbled, but it was the figure of Wallace, unexpected, unheralded, uncompromising, that carried the flame. From the valleys and villages of Scotland rose a movement that would soon ignite into open war. The stage was set for a rebellion that would shake the island, challenge Edward's might, and inscribe William Wallace's name forever in the story of resistance. Out of obscurity, Wallace had become the voice of a restless people. his defiance spreading from skirmishes in the countryside to the imagination of a nation. What began as scattered blows against English officials was turning into organized resistance. Scotland, long fractured and subdued, now found in him a figure bold enough to challenge Edward's might. And soon, that challenge would be tested on a battlefield where the fate of rebellion would hang in the balance, a narrow bridge over the River Forth at a town called Stirling. By the summer of 1297, the embers of rebellion in Scotland had flared into open flame. William Wallace, once an obscure knight, now stood at the head of a movement that drew strength not from the favor of nobles, but from the will of the people. He was joined by Andrew Moray, a young nobleman from the north who had risen in his own region with equal determination. Together, they forged a partnership, one born of necessity, sharpened by shared purpose, that would lead to the first great triumph of Scottish arms against Edward's mighty kingdom. The stage for this triumph was the town of Stirling, the key to northern Scotland. Whoever controlled Stirling controlled the road to the Highlands and the heartlands beyond. There, spanning the River Forth, stood a narrow wooden bridge. It was little more than a bottleneck, allowing only a handful of men to cross at a time. To the English commanders Hugh de Cressingham and John de Warenne, it seemed a trivial obstacle. To Wallace and Moray, it was the perfect trap. The English host was vast, numbering in the tens of thousands, with knights, infantry, and cavalry assembled to stamp out rebellion once and for all. Their confidence was as great as their numbers, for they believed themselves superior in arms and discipline, yet their strength, if mismanaged, could become their undoing. Wallace and Moray understood this. They chose not to meet the enemy in open ground, where the weight of English cavalry would be crushing, but to lure them into a place where their advantage became a weakness. On the morning of September 11th, 1297, the English began to advance. From the high ground, Wallace and Moray watched as the first contingents crossed the bridge, single file, exposed and unable to maneuver. The Scots waited in silence, holding their ground until a sufficient portion of the enemy had crossed. Then, with sudden ferocity, they struck. The narrow bridge became a trap sprung shut. English soldiers, cut off from support, found themselves pressed between the river at their backs and the Scots pressing forward. Horses panicked, men stumbled, and the weight of numbers that had promised victory now became chaos. Those still on the far side of the river could only watch as their comrades faltered, powerless to aid them. The bridge, clogged with men and panic, offered no salvation. In the swirl of combat, Wallace and Moray's leadership shone. They directed their forces with precision, exploiting the terrain and the enemy's overconfidence. Against all expectation, the great English host was broken. Hugh de Cressingham, the king's treasure in Scotland, fell in the rout, and the survivors fled in disarray. For the first time in living memory, Scotland had not merely resisted, but triumphed. The victory at Stirling Bridge was more than a battlefield success. It was a revelation. A people long dismissed as weak, divided, and incapable of standing against England had dealt a crushing blow to one of the mightiest armies in Europe. Wallace and Moray became heroes overnight, symbols of a Scotland that could still claim its freedom. News of the triumph spread quickly, carrying hope into every glen and valley. Yet the cost was not without sorrow. Andrew Moray, gravely wounded in the fighting, would not live to see the fruits of victory. His death deprived Scotland of a gifted commander just as the struggle was gaining momentum. Still, his name endured, forever linked with Wallace in the memory of that day. In the months that followed, Wallace's stature grew. He was knighted, and by year's end he was acclaimed as Guardian of Scotland, ruling in the name of the absent king. For a brief and shining moment, it seemed as though the dream of independence might be realized. The English had been humbled, their armies scattered, their pride wounded. Scotland, so recently suffocated beneath Edward's shadow, had broken free, at least for now. The bridge at Stirling stood as a symbol, narrow, fragile, yet decisive. It was there that a nation proved it would not submit quietly, that courage and cunning could turn the tide even against overwhelming might. For Edward, the defeat was intolerable, a blow to his vision of dominion over the entire island. For the Scots, it was a promise that freedom was still within reach, if only they had the will to seize it. The victory at Stirling Bridge had shaken the foundations of English power, and lifted Scottish hopes higher than at any time in a generation. Yet battles, however glorious, could not alone secure a nation's freedom. From triumph arose the need for order, for leadership that could turn fleeting success into lasting independence. It was in this moment of fragile possibility that William Wallace, the soldier who had humbled an empire, was called to take on a greater mantle, not merely as a warrior, but as guardian of Scotland. In the aftermath of Stirling Bridge, Scotland seemed reborn. The English host had been shattered, Edward's authority humbled, and for the first time in years, the kingdom breathed freely. From the triumph emerged William Wallace, no longer a mere knight of obscurity, but a leader exalted by victory. By the end of 1297, he was knighted and, more remarkably, acclaimed as Guardian of Scotland, ruling in the absent name of John Balliol. It was a title born of necessity, for the throne stood vacant, and the people demanded a figure who could carry the banner of independence. Yet Wallace's new authority was fragile, suspended between the will of the people and the suspicion of the nobility. The great magnates of Scotland, men like the Bruces and the Commons, had long measured their fortunes by lineage and calculation. To them, Wallace was an outsider, a man of no great family, thrust into prominence by war rather than blood. His rise challenged their assumptions about who had the right to lead. While they acknowledged his victory, many withheld their loyalty, waiting to see if his success could endure. The unity of the battlefield did not easily translate into the unity of government. As guardian, Wallace sought to turn military triumph into political legitimacy. He presided over councils, issued documents in Balliol's name, and tried to maintain order in a land scarred by war. His ambition was not only to resist England, but to prove that Scotland could govern itself even in the absence of a king. Yet his task was formidable. With nobles divided and resources strained, his authority often rested more on inspiration than on established power. Diplomacy, too, became part of his mission. Wallace understood that Scotland could not stand alone against the might of Edward I, whose resources dwarfed those of the northern kingdom. Thus he turned abroad, reaching to France, where Scotland's old ally still watched England warily. In 1299, Scottish envoys carried Wallace's appeals to the French court, seeking recognition and support. The echoes of the old alliance forged under Balliol still lingered, and Wallace hoped to strengthen it. To France, a Scotland in rebellion was a valuable counterweight against England's ambitions on the continent. Wallace's efforts abroad were remarkable for a man of his origins. He moved in circles of kings and courts, presenting himself not merely as a warrior, but as a statesman. Though the responses from France were cautious, they marked an acknowledgment. Scotland was not yet conquered, and its cause had a voice beyond its borders. For the Scots at home, the very act of seeking foreign support reinforced the idea that their struggle was not the quarrel of rebels, but the assertion of a sovereign nation. Still, the cracks at home widened. Many nobles resented Wallace's prominence, and some whispered that he sought to elevate himself above his station. Others simply doubted that he could withstand Edward's inevitable response. The Guardian of Scotland was a symbol of defiance, but symbols could not erase the reality of division. The stage was being set for new trials, and soon the weight of Edward's wrath would fall upon Scotland once more. For now, though, Wallace stood at the height of his fame, victor of Stirling, Guardian of Scotland, and envoy to foreign kings. His rule was precarious, contested, yet undeniably real. In him, Scotland had found a leader who embodied its defiance, even as the nobility hesitated. The question that lingered was whether inspiration could withstand the storm of conquest yet to come. For a brief moment, Wallace seemed to hold Scotland's destiny in his hands, a guardian who embodied the defiance of an oppressed people and gave voice to their hope. Yet glory is fragile when set against the weight of empire. Edward I, humiliated by Stirling and enraged by the challenge to his authority, could not allow such defiance to stand. Even as Wallace reached outward for allies and struggled to hold unity at home, the storm was gathering. In 1298, it would break, not through the hands of deputies or distant lords, but under the iron will of Longshanks himself, as king and conqueror rode north to bring Scotland to heel at Falkirk. The triumph at Stirling had electrified Scotland, but it had also stung Edward I to the core. The king, who had humbled Wales and bent Scotland's nobles to his will, could not abide such defiance. To him, the rebellion was not a matter of local insurrection, but an affront to his vision of dominion over the entire island. In 1298, he resolved to lead the response himself. This time, it would not be left to deputies or to divided command. Edward Longshanks would march north in person, determined to demonstrate the full weight of English power. The army he gathered was immense by the standards of the age. Tens of thousands of men answered his call. Armored knights from England's shires, infantry from the towns, and contingents of longbowmen drawn from Wales. Supplies were assembled with meticulous care, for Edward understood that victory required not just numbers, but endurance. His presence at the head of the host gave it a sense of inevitability. Chroniclers describe the advance northward as a tide, rolling over the border with banners unfurled, the king, himself tall in the saddle, embodying the iron resolve of conquest. Wallace, still guardian of Scotland, prepared as best he could. He had inspired his country with his defiance, but he lacked the resources to meet Edward's power on equal terms. His strategy was shaped by necessity to avoid direct confrontation until conditions favored him, to draw the English into hostile terrain, and to rely on the resilience of his infantry rather than the heavy cavalry he did not possess. In the summer of 1298, the two forces moved toward one another, their collision inevitable. The battlefield chosen was near the town of Falkirk, close to the River Carron. There, Wallace arranged his men in schiltrons, tight circles or squares of spearmen bristling outward, designed to withstand cavalry. Between the formations lay gaps filled by archers, while the few mounted men at his command formed a meager reserve. It was a formation born of ingenuity, meant to neutralize the crushing charge of Edward's knights. The English king, however, had weapons of his own. His longbowmen, honed in the hills of Wales, were unmatched in range and power. As the battle opened, their arrows rained down upon the Scottish archers, breaking their lines and leaving the schiltrons exposed. Then came the English cavalry, armored and disciplined, surging forward to press against the hedges of spears. The schiltrons held for a time, the Scots bracing against the storm, but with their supporting archers gone and no relief in sight, their formations began to break under the unrelenting assault. Edward's combination of tactics, archers to weaken, cavalry to shatter, proved devastating. What had worked at Stirling Bridge, the clever use of terrain, and the bottleneck of the crossing, could not be repeated here. On open ground against the full might of Edward's army, Wallace was outmatched. The field of Falkirk became a test not of inspiration, but of resources, and in that test the Scots could not prevail. As the day wore on, the Scottish army collapsed into retreat. Wallace himself withdrew, escaping the field, but leaving behind a nation once more humbled. The dream that had risen so brightly after Stirling now dimmed in the shadow of Edward's wrath. Falkirk was not merely a defeat. It was a demonstration that England's king, when he chose to act in person, remained a force too powerful to be resisted in open battle. Yet even in defeat, the legend of Wallace endured. His courage had rallied a nation, his leadership had given Scotland a taste of freedom, and his survival meant that resistance was not yet extinguished. For Edward, Falkirk was vindication, a display of his supremacy, a reminder to all Britain that the hammer still struck true. For Scotland, it was a wound, but not a death. The fight for independence would continue, carried forward by the memory of defiance and by leaders yet to rise. Falkirk had shattered the dream of meeting Edward's might in open battle, but it did not extinguish the spirit of resistance. Though Wallace was broken on the field, he was not yet defeated in heart. Stripped of his title, hounded by enemies, and left with little but his resolve, he turned from the clash of armies to the shadows of the glens. What followed was no longer the story of grand victories, but of a hunted man whose defiance kept alive the flame of freedom. Out of defeat, Wallace began the final chapter of his struggle, one that would carry him from outlaw to legend. After the disaster at Falkirk, William Wallace's star seemed dim. His schiltrons had been broken, his forces scattered, and the great hope of defying Edward I in open battle lay in ruins. Yet Wallace did not disappear. Though stripped of his role as guardian of Scotland, he refused to surrender to despair or exile. Instead, he turned to a different form of resistance, one less visible than pitched battles, but no less dangerous to English rule. For years after Falkirk, Wallace waged a campaign of guerrilla war, moving through forests and glens, striking at isolated garrisons, ambushing patrols, harrying supply lines. He became a shadow on the land, a constant reminder that Scotland's submission was incomplete. The great nobles, divided among themselves and often hesitant to commit, sometimes looked on Wallace with suspicion. But to the common people, his defiance was proof that the struggle still lived. While the machinery of English governance spread across Scotland, Wallace's name echoed as a vow that independence had not been forgotten. Edward, relentless as ever, sought to extinguish this lingering fire. He tightened his grip, building castles, stationing garrisons, and co-opting Scottish nobles into his service. One by one, many of the magnates bent to his power, preferring compromise to ruin. But Wallace stood apart. He refused to swear fealty, refused to bend the knee, and in so doing marked himself as the last free champion of his people. By 1305, the net had begun to close. Betrayal, that old companion of rebellion, played its role. Wallace was captured near Glasgow, handed over by men who may once have called him ally. From there, he was carried south across the border, through the land he had long resisted, to the heart of Edward's realm, London. The trial was swift, for the verdict had been decided before he ever stood in the dock. He was branded a traitor to the English crown, a charge Wallace rejected, declaring that he had never sworn allegiance to Edward and could not betray a king who had never been his lord. But Edward's court was not a place for debate. The sentence was severe, designed to extinguish not only the man, but the idea he represented. And yet, in destroying Wallace, Edward gave him immortality. Chroniclers, poets, and the people themselves preserved his story. In the streets of London, he met his end, but in the valleys of Scotland, his name lived on. Wallace had fought not for crown or wealth, but for the simple truth that his country should be free. That truth, carried in song and legend, outlived the man. From rebel knight to guardian, from battlefield victor to hunted outlaw, Wallace's journey was one of both triumph and tragedy. But in death, he became more than either. He became a symbol. His defiance in the face of overwhelming odds, his refusal to bend, and his ultimate sacrifice turned him into a figure larger than life. Edward had sought to make him an example of fear. Instead, he became an example of courage. In the years that followed, Scotland's struggle would continue under new leaders, men like Robert the Bruce, who would one day carry the cause to Bannockburn. But behind them all stood the shadow of Wallace, the memory of the man who had shown that resistance was possible. The English crown could capture him, try him, and end his life, but it could not erase the spark he had lit. Thus, William Wallace passed from history into legend. His was not the story of an unbroken string of victories, but of resilience, defiance, and belief in a nation's right to stand free. And though Edward Longshanks had silenced the man, he had unwittingly helped create the myth, one that would endure long after both king and rebel lay in their graves. Wallace's death had closed one chapter of Scotland's struggle, but it did not end the story. Though the man was gone, the idea he embodied lingered, stirring in the hearts of nobles and common folk alike. In the silence that followed his execution, the question remained: who would carry the banner forward? The answer would not come from the shadows of outlawry, but from the halls of Scotland's nobility. Into the space left by Wallace's martyrdom stepped Robert the Bruce, a figure very different in birth and ambition, yet destined to shape the next stage of the war for Scotland's soul. In the years following Wallace's capture and execution, the struggle for Scotland seemed leaderless, adrift between noble rivalries and the heavy hand of Edward I. Yet within this uncertainty, a new figure began to emerge, one whose path was far more complex than Wallace's. Robert the Bruce, grandson of a noble claimant in the great cause, was a man of lineage, ambition, and shifting loyalties. Unlike Wallace, who had risen from obscurity on the strength of defiance, Bruce belonged to the great houses of Scotland, entangled in their politics and bound by the weight of inheritance. At first, Bruce's loyalties appeared uncertain. He had at times sworn homage to Edward, securing his estates and safeguarding his family's influence. Like many nobles, he measured survival by balancing between resistance and submission. To some, this made him seem unreliable. a man willing to bend with the wind. Yet behind the careful maneuvering lay a restless ambition. Bruce believed he had a rightful claim to Scotland's crown, and he was unwilling to consign that dream to ashes. By the first years of the new century, Edward's grip on Scotland appeared unbreakable. Wallace was gone, the nobles divided, and the English king's authority spread through castles and garrisons across the land. But the embers of rebellion still glowed, and Bruce, watching closely, began to prepare his own moment. He knew that Scotland could not remain forever a province. The question was not if resistance would rise again, but who would lead it. The decisive moment came in 1306 in the town of Dumfries. There, in the shadowed halls of Greyfriars Church, Bruce met his great rival John Comyn, head of the powerful Comyn family. The Commons had long been supporters of John Balliol's line, and their claim to the throne rivaled Bruce's own. Words were exchanged, tempers flared, and in that charged instant, Bruce struck Comyn down. Whether planned or sudden, the act was irrevocable. With Comyn's death, Bruce removed his greatest competitor, but also committed himself fully to the path of kingship. There could be no return, no compromise with Edward, no reconciliation with rival nobles. He had chosen his destiny. Within weeks, Bruce moved decisively. At Scone, the ancient seat of Scottish coronations, he had himself crowned King of Scots. The ceremony was hastily arranged, lacking the grandeur of earlier coronations, but the symbolism was powerful. Scotland once more had a king, not imposed by Edward or chosen by arbitration, but self-proclaimed in defiance of all opposition. The risks were immense. Edward, still vigorous despite age, viewed Bruce's act as rebellion of the highest order. Many Scottish nobles remained hostile or uncertain, unwilling to forgive the killing of Comyn or to rally behind a man whose past loyalties had wavered. Yet Bruce pressed forward, driven by a conviction that Scotland could not be free without a monarch strong enough to unite it. Thus began a new chapter in the struggle. Where Wallace had been the sword of defiance, Bruce sought to be both sword and crown. His claim to kingship gave the rebellion a focus, yet it also placed a target squarely upon him. He was no longer merely a noble among nobles, he was the embodiment of Scottish independence, and for Edward, he became the enemy to be destroyed at all costs. The coronation of Robert the Bruce in 1306 was not the culmination of a long-prepared triumph, but the opening of a desperate gamble. It marked the rebirth of a cause thought broken, yet its outcome was uncertain, shadowed by betrayal, division, and the relentless power of England. Still, in that moment, Scotland had found its king, and the long road to freedom would now bear his name. Bruce's coronation had lit a flame in Scotland, but it also cast a long shadow. In seizing the crown, he had claimed the mantle of kingship, yet he had also invited the fury of England and the vengeance of his rivals. What began in triumph at Scone would soon descend into hardship and exile, as the new king discovered that the path to sovereignty was strewn not with laurels, but with trials that threatened to break him. Robert the Bruce's coronation at Scone in 1306 was a bold declaration, but it also marked the beginning of the darkest chapter in his life. In proclaiming himself king, he had thrown down a gauntlet not only to Edward I, but also to many of his own countrymen. Scotland was far from united, and the Comyn faction, enraged by the killing of John Comyn, aligned itself firmly against him. For Edward, the matter was clear. Bruce was a rebel usurper, and his claim to kingship would be crushed with ruthless determination. Edward responded swiftly. Though well into his 60s, the king known as Longshanks still possessed the iron energy of his youth. He called his banners, and the full might of England advanced northward. Scottish nobles who might once have wavered now saw prudence in siding with Edward, leaving Bruce with only a small following. The fragile crown he had seized was suddenly a burden that threatened to crush him. In the months that followed, Bruce's fortunes spiraled downward. His forces were defeated in a series of engagements by English armies and Scottish rivals alike. At Methven, near Perth, his army was routed, and Bruce himself barely escaped with his life. Pursued relentlessly, he found no sanctuary. His family suffered terribly. His brothers were captured and executed, his wife and daughter taken and held in captivity. For Bruce, the dream of kingship seemed to collapse almost as soon as it had begun. By the end of 1306, he had been driven into hiding. Legends tell of his flight across the Western Isles, of his narrow escapes, and his life reduced to that of an outlaw. Once a noble lord with vast estates, he now wandered from island to island, his followers dwindling, his cause seemingly broken. In the bitter winter months, he endured isolation and despair, forced to live by his wits as the shadow of Edward's power closed over Scotland. It was during this period, according to later tradition, that Bruce encountered the story of the spider spinning its web, an allegory that would endure in Scottish folklore. Watching the small creature try and fail, then try again, until success, Bruce is said to have drawn from it a lesson. Perseverance could triumph where strength alone could not. Whether legend or truth, it captured the essence of his struggle. To his enemies, Bruce was finished, a fugitive clinging to a crown no one recognized. To Edward, his downfall was confirmation of English supremacy. Yet beneath the defeats and humiliations, something remained unbroken. Bruce had risked everything for the throne, and though reduced to the life of an exile, he did not abandon his claim. The same fire that had driven him to strike down Comyn and seize the crown still burned, waiting for the chance to rise again. Thus, the years 1306 and 1307 became the crucible of Robert the Bruce. Stripped of power, hunted, and betrayed, he was tested more severely than at any other time in his life. But in that crucible, resilience was forged. What seemed like the end was, in truth, the beginning of a transformation, from a desperate outlaw to the leader who would one day unite his country. The story of Bruce in these early years is not one of victory, but of endurance. It is the story of a king without a throne, a fugitive carrying a crown in exile, and a nation waiting in silence for the chance to follow him once more. And in that silence, the struggle for Scotland's freedom was not extinguished. It was merely gathering strength for the battles yet to come. Bruce's trials had left him battered but unbroken, his crown carried in exile, and his cause waiting in silence. Yet while he struggled to endure, the shadow of Edward I still loomed over Britain, unyielding, relentless, and determined to crush Scotland's defiance once and for all. The clash between king and fugitive seemed inevitable, but fate was already preparing a different path. In 1307, as Bruce gathered strength for his return, the great hammer of the Scots would march one last time, and in that march, the balance of the struggle was destined to change forever. In the summer of 1307, the great figure who had dominated Britain for more than 3 decades made his final march. Edward I, Longshanks, the conqueror of Wales, the master of law and parliament, the hammer of Scotland, was determined, even in his advanced years, to crush the rebellion once and for all. Robert the Bruce had returned from the shadows, gathering strength, reclaiming castles, and igniting a war that Edward could not ignore. Though age had weighed on him and illness gnawed at his body, the king refused to yield. His last campaign was meant to end the defiance of Scotland forever. Edward's army assembled with the same grim resolve that had carried him through a lifetime of conquest. Veterans who had fought in Wales and on the continent marched once more at his command. But this time, their king was no longer the towering warrior of earlier days. He was now in his late 60s, burdened with fatigue and chronic disease. Even so, Edward pressed northward, his presence a reminder to all that he would not rest until Scotland was subdued. Chroniclers record that he vowed his bones would be carried with the army if death overtook him, so that even in death he might strike fear into the Scots. The march was slow, slowed by both logistics and the king's failing strength. The army reached Berg by Sands near Carlisle, poised on the borderlands, preparing for the final advance. It was there, on July 7, 1307, that Edward I breathed his last. The hammer had fallen silent. His death reverberated across Britain. For his supporters, it was the passing of one of England's greatest kings, a ruler of iron will who had shaped his realm with both sword and statute. He had subdued Wales with castles and law. He had imposed order on a turbulent nobility, and he had come closer than any before him to him, uniting the British Isles under one crown. For his enemies, particularly the Scots, it was the lifting of a great shadow. The man who had sworn to break them was gone, and with him, the relentless energy that had driven England's campaigns. Edward's legacy was complex. He was remembered as the Hammer of the Scots, a title both feared and hated north of the border, but one that testified to the determination with which he pursued conquest. Yet the hammer had not completed its task. Despite years of campaigning, despite victories at Falkirk and the crushing of Wallace, Scotland was not subdued. Castles remained in English hands, but Robert the Bruce still stood, his claim to the crown not extinguished, but renewed. Edward had fought to the very end, but the work of conquest remained unfinished. The throne passed to his son, Edward II. Where the father had been resolute, the son was indecisive. Edward II lacked the martial vigor and the relentless will that had defined Longshanks. He was more inclined to favor courtly pleasures, to lavish attention on favorites, and to govern by indulgence rather than iron command. To the English nobility, this was troubling. To the Scots, it was a sudden opening. The pressure that had borne down on them with such unrelenting force for decades was eased in an instant. For Robert the Bruce, the timing was providential. He had endured exile, defeat, and the loss of family, but now fortune turned. The death of Edward I removed the fiercest enemy Scotland had ever known. His successor was a king far less feared, a man unlikely to match his father's determination. The battlefield of Britain was changing, and Bruce, with patience and resilience forged in hardship, stood ready to seize the opportunity. Edward I's body was laid to rest in Westminster Abbey, beneath the inscription Edwardus Primus Scotorum Malleus, his est, 1308, Pactum serva. Here lies Edward I, Hammer of the Scots. Keep the vow. It was a fitting epitaph for a king who had devoted his life to conquest. Yet the vow was one his son could not keep. The hammer lay still, and in the silence, Scotland's chance for resurgence began. Thus ended the reign of Edward I, one of England's most formidable rulers. His shadow loomed long, his achievements undeniable, his failures equally clear. He had reshaped the kingdom of England and struck terror into its neighbors, but in the end he had not broken Scotland. His death on the border, within sight of the land he so long sought to subdue, was as symbolic as it was final. Edward Longshanks had carried his struggle to the grave, but the struggle itself would continue, and in that continuation, the story of Robert the Bruce would find its destiny. With Edward I laid to rest, the landscape of Britain shifted. The iron hand that had once pressed relentlessly upon Scotland was gone, leaving in its place a king far weaker in a realm momentarily uncertain. For Robert the Bruce, who had endured exile, defeat, and despair, the death of Longshanks was not only the end of an era, but the opening of a door. What had seemed impossible beneath Edward's shadow now flickered with possibility, and from that moment Bruce began to rebuild, quietly at first, but with a resolve that would soon reshape the war. After the death of Edward I in 1307, the fortunes of Robert the Bruce began to shift. What had seemed impossible in the dark days of exile now appeared within reach. The iron hand that had crushed Wallace and driven Bruce to the edge of ruin was gone, replaced by Edward II, a king far less feared, far less relentless. For Bruce, this change was providence. His years of wandering and defeat had tempered him, and now he seized the moment to rebuild. At first his successes were modest. Bruce struck not in great battles, but in small encounters, skirmishes fought in forests, glens, and mountain passes. He avoided the heavy English armies and instead targeted their garrisons, their supply lines, and those Scottish nobles who still supported Edward. Victory by victory, castle by castle, he chipped away at English control. To the chroniclers, it seemed as though the land itself had turned into Bruce's ally, harsh terrain swallowing the English advance, while the Scots, moving swiftly, struck and vanished like ghosts. The tide of war gradually changed. By 1309, Bruce had secured recognition from a parliament of Scottish clergy and nobles, affirming his claim to kingship. This was not mere sentiment. It was a declaration that Scotland's cause had legitimacy, that Bruce was no longer an outlaw, but the rightful monarch. Still, the struggle was far from won. The English crown remained powerful, and many castles in Scotland were still in foreign hands. Yet Bruce's persistence began to inspire. Just as Wallace had once kindled hope through defiance, Bruce now rekindled it through resilience and strategy. The years that followed became a relentless campaign of recovery. Bruce's brothers and loyal lieutenants fought alongside him, reclaiming territory piece by piece. At Llywelyn Hill in 1307, Bruce won a striking victory using marshy ground and disciplined infantry to repel English cavalry. It was a small battle compared to Falkirk or Stirling, but it marked a turning point, proof that the English could be beaten, not just by circumstance, but by Bruce's command. From then on, his momentum grew. Castles such as Inverlochy, Forfar, and Aberdeen fell back into Scottish hands. Where once Bruce had fled from one hiding place to another, now he dictated the course of the war. His strategy was clear: deny the English their strongholds, starve their garrisons, and make Scotland ungovernable for an occupying power. He destroyed fortifications he could not hold, ensuring they would not serve his enemies again. Each act, though harsh, brought Scotland closer to freedom. The transformation was extraordinary. In 1306, Bruce had been a fugitive, mocked, and despised. His crown little more than a dream. By 1314, he stood as a king in more than name. His authority stretched across the land. His armies were seasoned and confident, and the people, weary of subjugation, looked to him with renewed faith. The bitter failures of his early reign had become the foundation of his resurgence. The story of Robert the Bruce in these years is one of steady, deliberate ascent. He did not rely on a single dazzling victory, but on a chain of smaller triumphs that slowly rebuilt a nation's spirit. Each success erased the memory of exile. Each recovered castle rekindled belief. It was a tale not of sudden glory, but of patience, endurance, and unyielding will. As the year 1314 approached, the struggle reached its climax. The English still held Stirling Castle, one of the great fortresses of Scotland, and Edward II could not allow it to fall without response. A confrontation was inevitable, one that would decide not just the fate of a stronghold, but the destiny of two kingdoms. From the ashes of despair, Robert the Bruce had risen, ready to meet the test that would define him. By 1314, Bruce's long struggle had reached its breaking point. Years of patient recovery, of castles reclaimed, and victories won in glens and passes had brought Scotland back from the brink. Yet all of that hard-won progress now hinged on a single fortress, Stirling. Its fate would draw Edward II north with the might of England behind him, and with it, the moment Bruce had been preparing for. What had begun in exile and despair was about to be tested on the field of destiny. In the summer of 1314, Scotland stood on the edge of destiny. After years of hardship, exile, and patient recovery, Robert the Bruce had rebuilt his cause from the ashes. Yet one great obstacle remained: Stirling Castle, one of the most formidable English strongholds in the kingdom. Its garrison had agreed to surrender by midsummer, if not relieved. For Bruce, this was both an opportunity and a risk. If he could hold the siege, he would gain a prize of immense strategic and symbolic value. But Edward II of England could not allow such a loss without response. He summoned the full weight of his realm and marched north. The English host was vast, perhaps the largest army ever to cross into Scotland. Knights clad in armor, infantry in their thousands, archers drawn from the shires and from Wales. Chroniclers speak of banners filling the horizon, a tide of men and horses pressing northward with the confidence of sheer numbers. To many, it seemed inconceivable that the Scots could withstand such force. Bruce's army was smaller, perhaps a quarter the size of Edward's, but what it lacked in numbers, it gained in discipline, experience, and the careful use of terrain. Bruce chose his ground with the precision of a seasoned commander. Near the Bannock Burn, a stream winding through boggy fields south of Stirling, he positioned his men in defensive formations. The ground was narrow, marshy, and ill-suited to cavalry, the very strength of the English army. Where Edward's power was greatest, Bruce had contrived to make it weakest. On June 23rd, the opening clashes set the tone. English knights, eager to scatter the Scots, advanced recklessly. In a celebrated moment, Robert the Bruce himself met Henry de Bohun, a charging knight, in single combat. With calm resolve, Bruce struck down his opponent, a symbolic act that lifted Scottish morale and unnerved the enemy. It was a reminder that this was not the Bruce of exile and flight, but a king who had mastered the art of war. The following day, June 24th, the full battle was joined. Edward's army pressed forward, but the Scots, formed in their tight schiltrons of spearmen, held firm. English cavalry, hampered by the marshy ground and hemmed in by narrow approaches, could not break the lines. Arrows darkened the sky, but the English archers were poorly positioned and lacked the support needed to exploit their strength. The great army meant to crush Bruce in a single blow found itself entangled, its size becoming a hindrance rather than an advantage. Bruce's leadership was evident in every moment. His men fought not as scattered rebels, but as a disciplined host, confident in their cause and their king. The English, meanwhile, floundered. Edward II, lacking his father's iron resolve, failed to impose order or adapt to the terrain. Confusion spread, and soon the mighty English host began to waver. What had begun as a show of overwhelming strength dissolved into retreat. By the end of the day, the field belonged to Scotland. The English army, broken and dispirited, fled south, leaving Stirling Castle to fall into Bruce's hands. What had once seemed a desperate gamble had become a resounding triumph. Against overwhelming odds, the Scots had won a victory that would echo for centuries. The Battle of Bannockburn was more than a military success. It was a turning point in the story of two nations. For Scotland, it was the moment of vindication, when the long years of suffering and division were redeemed by a single unifying triumph. For England, it was a humiliation, a reminder that even the greatest army could falter when led without vision. In the years that followed, the struggle for recognition continued. Formal independence would not be secured until the Treaty of Edinburgh-Northampton in 1328. Yet the essence of Bannockburn was immediate. Scotland had proven itself unconquered, and Robert the Bruce had transformed from fugitive to king, from exile to liberator. The battlefield itself, a place of marshes and narrow ground, became hallowed in memory. Songs and chronicles preserved the tale, celebrating the courage of the Scots and the brilliance of their king. Edward I had sought to be remembered as the Hammer of Scotland. Edward II would be remembered for the shattering blow he suffered at Bannockburn. Thus, at Bannockburn in 1314, the destiny of Scotland was affirmed. Through hardship and resilience, through patient strategy and unwavering resolve, Robert the Bruce had led his people to victory. It was not the end of the struggle, but it was the moment when Scotland's independence was secured in spirit and its king secured in legend. The thunder of Bannockburn seemed to close the chapter of Edward Longshanks, for it was his son who suffered the humiliation of defeat. Yet the shadow of the old king lingered still. Though he had died 7 years before, his castles stood unbroken across Wales. His statutes shaped the very law of England, and his campaigns left scars and legends in Scotland. To understand the triumph of Bruce, one must also reckon with the legacy of Edward, the conqueror, the lawgiver, the hammer of the Scots, whose reign had changed Britain forever. Edward I's death on the border in 1307 marked the end of one of England's most formidable kings, but his story did not vanish with him. His legacy lived on in stone, in parchment, and in memory. To understand Edward Longshanks is to see both the soldier who carved his will into the land and the lawgiver who shaped his kingdom with statutes and courts. His reign was a tale of conquest and governance, ambition and paradox. In Wales, his triumph was complete. 2 great campaigns had broken the native princes, and with the fall of Llywelyn ap Gruffudd, the dream of Welsh independence ended. Edward did not stop at victory. He remade the land. Across the rugged landscape, he raised castles, Caernarfon, Conwy, Harlech, Beaumaris, fortresses of such scale and endurance that they still dominate the horizon today. These were not only military bastions, but symbols of a new order, physical reminders that Wales now belonged to the English crown. By granting his son the title Prince of Wales, Edward fixed the conquest into the fabric of monarchy. From that moment, Wales was forever bound to England. In Scotland, the story was less certain. There, Edward earned his dread title, the Hammer of the Scots. He deposed John Balliol, broke William Wallace at Falkirk, and placed garrisons throughout the lowlands. Yet, the hammer never shattered the spirit it struck. Wallace, executed in London, became a martyr whose name rallied his countrymen. Robert the Bruce, once an exile and outlaw, seized the crown and transformed defeat into resurgence. Edward's campaigns crushed but did not conquer, humiliated but did not erase. In striving to dominate, he gave Scotland the cause and the heroes that would keep its independence alive. Edward was not only a king of war, he was a king of law. His statutes of Westminster standardized practices of property, inheritance, and governance, strengthening the authority of the crown and the reach of royal courts. He summoned parliaments more regularly, making consultation with nobles and commons an established part of rule. England under Edward became not just a realm of battlefields and castles, but a realm of statutes and councils. He showed that a medieval monarch could wield both the sword and the law, binding subjects with force and with precedent. His image reflected this duality. Longshanks, the tall and gaunt king, was remembered as stern, disciplined, and relentless. To allies, he could be loyal and devout. To enemies, merciless. He was both admired and feared, a figure who embodied the very edge of medieval kingship, unyielding, ambitious, and effective. The consequences of his reign endured long after his burial at Westminster Abbey. In Wales, his conquest was permanent. The castles he built remained instruments of English rule, their presence so imposing that no later uprising could overturn them. The land was subdued, though its culture lived on in songs and traditions. In Scotland, Edward's legacy was unfinished. His armies had marched deep, his victories seemed decisive, yet his death left the work incomplete. Robert the Bruce would carry the struggle forward to Bannockburn, where Scotland's independence was affirmed. Edward had sought to erase sovereignty, but instead, he sharpened it. The resistance he provoked became the foundation of a national identity that survived for centuries. In England, he was remembered as one of the great kings of the Middle Ages. He had built castles and institutions, expanded his realm's authority, and given the crown greater stability. His reign blended the iron of conquest with the order of law. But for the Welsh and the Scots, his memory was harsher. The conqueror, the oppressor, the hammer. His life reads as a story of contrasts, castles towering above Welsh hills, statutes inscribed in Westminster's halls, armies clashing at Falkirk and Stirling, and finally, the solemn words carved on his tomb, "Here lies Edward I, Hammer of the Scots." Keep the vow he had dreamed of uniting Britain under one crown. He achieved half that dream, and in failing to achieve the rest, he left behind a legacy of defiance, as enduring as his conquests. Edward Longshanks left England stronger than he found it. He gave it laws that lasted and territories it never lost, yet he also gave its neighbors reason never to forget him. He is remembered as conqueror and lawgiver, hammer and builder, feared by some, respected by others, impossible to ignore. His reign ended at the edge of Scotland fittingly, for there his ambition met its limits. And from those limits sprang legends, rebellions, and the continued struggle that would shape Britain for centuries.